All right, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar presentation. My name is Maria Nuessi, and I am the moderator for today's presentation. I am joined today by two experts, Dr. Teresa Hurst and Dr. Glenn Albirght, who are going to share insights on how to support students as they transition into a remote environment due to the COVID-19 epidemic. They're going to cover both from a learning perspective, what can faculty and staff and administrators do to support them to have a successful semester and academic year, as well as from a mental health and mental wellness perspective, what can the campus community do to make sure that the students are supported as they make this transition and beyond. So with that, I want to transition over to Dr. Teresa Hurst just to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background, and then we'll hand it over to Dr. Glenn Albirght as well.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of New York, and I also direct the Counseling Center at Baruch College, which is part of the City University of New York system. And I also run the APA training program, APA, the American Psychological Association internship program at our site. So thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you for being here. Dr. Glenn Albirght?
Yes, thank you, Maria, for having me here also. I am a clinical psychologist and associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Baruch College. And I teach those large introduction to psychology classes that many people in this listening audience have taken. And I also teach our graduate mental health counseling students a course in trauma, grief, and recovery.
Great, thank you both for being here. So as we get started on the first sort of question or topic that we want to dive into today, the first thing is, a little bit of an overview about what are the challenges that students are experiencing as they're acclimated to an online environment. On the screen are a couple of different areas that kind of range covers. Can each of you just give us a little bit of an overview of what that looks like? What are some of the challenges that the students are facing today? Dr. Teresa, would you like to get us started?
I can jump in. So they're both adjusting to an academic online environment, but they're also adjusting to an online environment for all the support services that they were engaged in before the crisis. So that's a transition for them. And then also, if they were involved in student groups on campus, some of those are now transitioning to a remote environment. So there's a lot of changes they're going through, and I think it's caused a lot of stress for them as they make this adjustment. Part of it is that some of them live with their many students live with their families still, so they're trying to carve out little spaces in their apartments and their homes to be able to interact with other students and professors, to do mental health sessions somewhere in the house. Some students are in the closets or going out and sitting on a park bench just to try to engage in their academic and support service needs. So those are some of the things that come up. Some of them don't have privacy. So if they're trying to do telehealth, if they're in a room, they might be overheard. So that can be difficult. And some of the things that we also heard is that they don't have the appropriate devices in order to interact through a remote environment. So a lot of colleges are actually trying to distribute devices to students. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about.
Yeah, those totally agree with all those points. And what I was thinking of is it is also difficult for faculty that in many cases, this is the first time that they've taught an online course, and being the first time, they're not always sure how to go about it. And one common problem for new faculty going online is that they overwhelm students with material, with expectations, with assignments. And the students are experiencing this in several courses, and they feel, rightfully so, really overwhelmed, and to the point where they're even questioning whether they should continue this semester. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit more in terms of what faculty can do to make the student experience a little bit better. But both students and faculty are struggling with tremendous changes, and overlap that with the COVID-19, being locked down, can't go out, being stuck in a home environment maybe in which there's added stressors. So there's a lot to talk about, a lot to take into account.
I'll jump in just for a few more things. What we've heard from students talking about is that it's really hard to concentrate on their academic work. It's hard to stay motivated because they're also dealing with losses in their life, people who are sick, maybe people who've even passed away, and that it's just hard to be productive. And they may be putting pressure on themselves to be as productive as they were before the crisis. So I think that's one of the challenges, is how to adjust and lower your expectations for the level of productivity that you expect from yourself.
Do you find, and just to kind of expand on some of the things you've covered, do you find that faculty, as they're making that transition to an online environment, they're maintaining the same level of coursework, or is that it's getting heavier? What does that look like for the student in terms of the academic pressure that they're feeling now that they're in an online environment, especially for students that may have never taken an online course before, that are not familiar with how to navigate an online portal like Blackboard, et cetera, for their assignments, et cetera?
Yeah, I can certainly speak to that. I mean, being that this is a new environment for many of them, that there's a significant amount of difficulty for some in learning in this new environment, being that they've never really been exposed to it. And again, the faculty member is not used to teaching it. So there's kind of like expectations on the part of both parties that aren't aligned. So in part of successfully maintaining and conducting online learning, it's kind of like you have to foster a sense of community, not only between the students, but also between the teacher and the students, that the students have to be involved in terms of having a say in what's going on in the course. That is, the faculty member has to be a little bit flexible, listening to the students. So having that sense of control kind of helps with the helplessness that students often feel in this new environment. And it really empowers them if the faculty member invites them in, asks them for their suggestions, how I'm doing, what could I do better, and really recruits them as part of the process of learning.
Great. Thank you. And so as we kind of move towards the impact that this is having on the mental health of the student. So can we, as we transition to the next slide, can you speak to the impact that all of this is having on the student mental health?
And what we're hearing from counselors and from the students that I'm working with, that there's been a huge increase in their anxiety, just feeling really scared, having anxiety symptoms. If a student is struggling with obsessive compulsive disorder, the virus is increasing some of that struggle. Depression is on the rise. Of course, people feel extra isolated because they're not able to interact with their loved ones and their communities. And so we're seeing all kinds of symptoms increased. And there's also, when you're in times of stress, especially economic stress, and a lot of our students are going through financial stressors right now, violence can increase in the home too. So interpersonal violence, whether that's emotional, verbal, physical, even sexual at times. So we have to make sure that we're looking out for that and supporting students to keep them safe during this time. And students have also talked about just they're having to spend more time with the people they live with, which can be a stressful thing. And so struggling with interpersonal conflicts and difficulties. Some of our Asian and Asian American students have reported some racism and discrimination when they did leave the home. And so some of them are saying they're even afraid to go out because of that, because of the racism they might experience. And so they're staying in even more. Also, what we know from, I've done a lot of research and clinical work in the area of trauma, and what we know is that when someone's going through a trauma, it can bring up the old traumas too, symptoms of old traumas, memories of old trauma. So I think we're gonna see that a lot more as time goes on, that as there's more people dying from this disease, that's gonna impact students in that way, because sometimes they're not able to say goodbye, or they're not able to see people physically, they're not able to hug them goodbye. And then they're also grieving alone at times. Some students are living all by themselves and are isolated, but then also there's not the normal memorial services and rituals that we do to process grief. So in absence of those rituals, people are alone, grieving all by themselves. So you don't get to participate in the rituals, but you also don't get to be around other people who have loved those people. So that can be difficult. I also think a lot about our international students who have even more increased anxiety and stressors because they're isolated from their families. They're worried about their families back home. And also some of them are worried about not being able to get jobs after graduation. Usually they get a period about 1 year to do work here before their visa runs out. And some students have expressed real worries about that, not being able to get a job in this market, especially because it's being impacted economically so much. There's a whole bunch. I'll let you speak too, Glenn, because we could go on and on about this part.
Yeah, I think, gosh, you did a great job. The only thought that came to my head is that in terms of trauma or past trauma, one of the things that victims experience as a result of trauma is a lack of control, a feeling of helplessness. And so now they're placed in an environment in which there is no control. I mean, there's outside of themselves, they have no control over what COVID-19 is going to do. They have no control over what local, state, and federal governments are doing. The only thing they have control over is really what's going on inside them. And this type of environment can exacerbate those feelings of stress and anxiety that were brought on by early traumas. And then again, Teresa, as you mentioned it, being locked in a household that is not necessarily supportive. I mean, I know a lot of students that one of the main reasons they really enjoy college is because they got away from home. And in this case, now they're kind of stuck there and the tension begins to escalate. The feelings of helplessness, lack of power, lack of control escalate. And all that anxiety really interferes with the ability to focus, to stay concentrated, to learn, and will compromise their ability to be successful. So it's pretty disarming.
Yeah, I'll add to that the things that students used to be able to rely on, in addition to being outside the home and being on campus to cope. So maybe classes that they used to take, or the going to the gym, or doing, being involved in activities, group activities for support. They're not able to do that. They could do it over the Zoom or Facebook and FaceTime, but it's not the same thing. So their coping strategies are down and they're struggling to cope. And the other thing that I've heard about that we didn't mention is students worrying about graduating on time. So is this going to affect their coursework, their grades? Are they going to be able to graduate? Some students who are on scholarships have to graduate within a particular number of years, and they're worried about that. And they're worried about their own health. We didn't mention that. So not only the health of their family members and loved ones, but they're scared about how this virus could impact their own bodies.
Right. I've known students who are telling me that the more television they watch, the more news they watch, the more they begin to somaticize, the more anxiety they start to experience, the more worry they have. And so one of the things that you need to do is to stop watching so much news, because that can be a trigger that brings about a significant amount of anxiety and worry.
Mm-hmm. And what we also know is that students sometimes turn to substance to cope with their anxiety and depressive feelings. So that we have to keep our eyes out for that too, just the increased risk for misuse and abuse of substances at this time.
Right.
And I also wanted to ask, there's so many layers that are impacted right now. I know that there are many students who work in the industry of, the food and service industry as a means to earn money for school or for housing. Do you think the economic impact that COVID-19 is having, is that another layer for students who are working students, or who are adult learners who may be in school full-time or part-time, but also have families and are parents and now have their kids at home? Can you speak a little bit about those extra layers that students are sort of dealing with?
Yeah, I can jump in. And in the counseling center, we're hearing a lot about students losing those jobs, being laid off or fired, and their family members losing income too. So it's a double whammy, because it's not only the students' income, but now the families who may be supporting them, or they're supporting their families, it can go both ways, adds a lot more stress and anxiety. So the fear levels are going up.
And then how can you be expected to study and do well academically when you're worried about not having enough money to pay for the rent, to buy food, to pay for fuel oil, to heat your apartment or home? It's untenable, and it's a real struggle for many.
So as we sort of lay the foundation for the challenges that students are dealing with right now as it relates to their mental health, let's talk about what can be done to support these students. I just was on another webinar where they were talking about how, as we made the transition to a remote environment, the priority has been emphasized on the academic side. And, when you look at the basic needs of people, the physiological needs are often the most important and the most that people are most concerned about. So let's talk a little bit about what can be done to support these students both academically and as well for their mental health.
Well, the first thing you have on that slide, normalizing and validating current reactions. I mean, that's really important, that what the student is feeling is like what a lot of other students are feeling. And they're not alone, that in having company, if there's going to be company like that, there is some solace. And in noticing that, it makes you feel better. It makes you kind of more accept your situation. So normalizing is incredibly important. And in terms of policies and procedures, I mean, many of that I'm aware of, the many colleges and universities are reaching out with students, and Teresa, you can talk about this more than I can, in terms of providing them with stress management seminars and other types of workshops that will be incredibly beneficial to them. In terms of more administrative components, I know there's some colleges that have asked the professors that if their students stop participating online, stop attending, that you email them, and if they don't get back to you within 1 or 2 days, that you go ahead and let the Dean of Students office know, and then they'll follow up and contact that student to make sure that they're okay. So having policies and procedures like that that protect the students, that are watching over them, is incredibly important.
Glenn, are you open?
Teresa, would you like to add?
Oh, I just was, Glenn, are you open to speaking a little bit about the flexibility around coursework, since you're part of the faculty? You may be able to speak to that part.
Sure. So one of the things, especially with new faculty, is I think I mentioned this before, they have a tendency to overload their students. Their expectations are too high, and the students end up being overwhelmed and not able to catch up or not able to cope. So faculty have to kind of like bring their expectations down a little bit. They have to prioritize what they think is important for students to learn. Now, I'm not suggesting that they compromise their pedagogy, but to really realign it with this new learning environment and be willing to work with students and to get their feedback, get their recommendations as to how to best reach them. And that adds to the collaborative framework that you have between a teacher and their students. In terms of grading, students have to clearly understand grading policies, procedures, and how they'll change as a result of going from face-to-face to online. And faculty have to be flexible in working with those expectations and maybe changing some of the ways in which they grade. They're flexible in terms of deadlines of students turning in material. I mean, we already talked about how students have all types of stressors outside that are going to impact on their being able to get in online. So the faculty member has to be flexible. And then remember, when you go into a synchronous delivery, there are a lot of students who really can't make it at the same time that they would normally have made it to their class for a face-to-face meeting. So synchronous lectures should be recorded and made available for those students who could not make it there. And those students who could not make it there, who taken advantage of the synchronous recordings, shouldn't be penalized for not being able to attend that particular lecture. So it's the sense of the faculty member having to work together with their students to come up with common solutions that will drive the learning, increase collaboration, and overall sense of, hey, I'm accomplishing something, and let's keep on going.
Yeah, so to look at all the barriers for students, because what we know is if a student's struggling with food insecurity, that's going to get in the way of them performing academically, as an example. So some of the colleges are handing out food vouchers, or making sure that food or like money for food gets distributed to students in need. You mentioned workshops, so because some of the students will be going through bereavement and grief processes around people they've lost, many colleges are offering coping with loss groups or bereavement and grieving groups to support those students through their grieving processes. And then what we know is also that mental health issues are one of the main factors that interfere with a student's ability to achieve their academic potential. So if we can help them address the depression, the anxiety, all these other symptoms that we mentioned previously, they could do better in school. So it's...
Absolutely.
Glenn, you mentioned some of these suggestions already, but can you talk about some practical things, maybe some things that you're already doing for your classes? What are some things that faculty can do to create a supportive online learning environment for their students, sort of translate some of those patterns that they have with their in-person classes that can be translated into that online environment to kind of create some consistency for the students?
Sure. Some of these things might seem kind of like obvious, but they really take on a bigger impact and effect, being that the students are dealing at higher stress levels because of COVID-19 and moving to an online environment. So this begins with kind of what I refer to as first on, last off. So when a faculty member is teaching online, I always feel that they should be there early before the course starts, 5 or 10 minutes. And then you can start an informal chat with the students. Now, this is assuming a synchronous delivery. You can ask them what's going on with them. And you can't really underemphasize the importance of a warm greeting, as opposed to, okay, let's get started, and then plunge into the material. That warm greeting that's genuine makes the instructor more approachable. It kind of like is something that students need to hear. And then once you start the lecture, there are some professors that are using just a brief moment for a mindfulness exercise or meditation exercise, like something as easy as just, let's take a minute just to breathe and to pay attention to making your exhale a little bit longer than your inhale. That's all you do. And we know that the exhale is controlled by the part of the autonomic nervous system that slows the heart rate down, the breathing down, the blood pressure, and so on. So just that very short moment kind of centers the student, and the faculty member should also join them, by the way. And then when you start the lecture, you should, like, again, ask them how they're doing, how everybody's doing. And when you end the lecture, some professors will be the first to end the session. Hang around. Don't be the first one off, because I found that as students begin to sign off, there's sometimes 1 or 2 students that hang around and say something like, hey, professor, I was wondering if, so it gives you an opportunity to really address those students, to be available. And the last thing, and this is kind of silly, but I found that it really is helpful. My students taught me this, is when you finally do end the lecture, wave, goodbye, right? That simple goodbye is very meaningful. Now, if I can go on, one really neat way to bring the students into the course is vis-a-vis discussion board questions. I'm not sure what LMS people uses. We use Blackboard, but if you post questions for the students to respond, certain types of questions, that it really helps them to deal with what's going on in their environment and their learning. So like for one example, one of my questions is, so what are you doing to deal with stress? Tell me about the activities you're doing, and students start posting these things like, I got involved in painting and drawing. I'm listening to music. I just got into folk music. And by the way, you ask them then to post what it is they're painting or drawing, or post a URL to that favorite piece of music, or what they're doing in yoga. I've had one student say that they're taking virtual vacations using Google Earth, which is so cool. So they're sharing this, they're feeling empowered, they're helping other students, and everybody's like kind of brought into this community. I remember, for example, in teaching synchronously on Blackboard, there's a section there where you can open up a whiteboard, and then you can start like typing in it, like you're writing on the Blackboard. So I opened up the whiteboard, and then unknown to me, because I was looking for what to load into it, is students started to draw on their own. And they started to draw pictures of faces and dogs and this and that. I said, holy smokes. And everybody was having a great time, because this whole screen would fill, then I would erase it, and they would go ahead and start drawing a little bit more. So doing 2 or 3 minutes of this, it's a lot of fun. The other part of this is a class journal. I mean, I love to give opportunities for students to be able to communicate with me personally without anybody else seeing what they're trying to say. So I have a form there where I ask them, what were your impressions about the last class, about the assignment? Any suggestions that you have for me? Any questions you think? Anything you didn't understand? Student feedback really helps fend off that sense of helplessness and lack of control, and influences the way that I deliver material. Coupled with this, you're asking them how they deal with stress. It's really helpful for you to tell them what's going on with you. Tell them, how you're coping, what's going on with your family. Them seeing your coping strategies helps to kind of validate what they're doing. Them hearing your understanding of what's going on in the world helps validate their view. And that is like really important. So those are the types of things that provide the students with this online sense of community, and it reduces anxiety, gives them a sense of control. And as long as you're flexible and respond to them, it will like really, you'll take advantage of this type of learning to the best it can possibly take an advantage of. I said a lot. You did. You shared a lot of great insights. I'm curious, are you hosting office hours online where students can just drop in and ask specific questions? Yeah, in addition to posting virtual office hours, I'm also, again, on early, right? So they can talk to me, and I stay late so they can talk to me. And I just want to emphasize, I didn't mention this because it's like kind of like really important, is that when you're teaching synchronously, you're going to get all types of interruptions. It's amazing. You're going to get children running in. You're going to get cats and dogs jumping up in the lap. You're going to get parents walking in the background, siblings, relatives, noises from the street. And as a faculty member, you just got to have to roll with it and sometimes play with it. So, oh, what a cute dog. And in fact, my students all want to see my dogs. So I have to take my laptop around and show them my dogs. My dogs, meanwhile, are kind of like running away because they don't know what's going on. But that's bringing them in. That makes me more approachable. And last, well, not last, but the next thing is the possibility of interlopers joining your class. That's not possible on Blackboard, but on Zoom, there have been people who have been crashing the course and posting all types of horrible things and pictures. And there's ways in which you can prevent that on Zoom, but it's very disruptive for students to all of a sudden have a non-student come in there and be so disruptive. And also, I said almost the last thing, so I'm going to keep going here. Students with disabilities. Sometimes faculty members aren't aware that they have a student with a learning disability. They need to find that out either from their learning disability center, or invite any students that need extra help or need ways in which the material can be presented to let you know, because you have to. It's very important that you meet their needs too. That's about it for now.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Can you share with us some best practices to help faculty and staff recognize signs of distress in their students remotely? Kick us off.
Sure, I can jump in. Just to remind faculty to look out for any changes in the students' behaviors. So it could be that they're changing their level of interacting. So maybe before, when they were in the classroom, this was a student that was very engaged and now they're completely disengaged. It could be that they're not coming to the online classes, so their attendance has dropped, or they're not completing assignments on time. So Glenn had mentioned that some colleges are reminding faculty to let their behavioral intervention teams know if a student has disappeared and they're worried about them. And then those behavioral intervention teams can reach out to the students to figure out what's getting in the way. So just recognizing those changes. Glenn also mentioned on a previous conversation, like posing a question, a weekly question that students can then respond to. So like, yeah, what are you doing to cope during this time? How are you doing? Just to check in to see. And also I've heard from some faculty that when they're reading writings of our students, they'll notice that the student's talking about feeling very depressed or down, or maybe even showing some signs of suicidal risk. And of course, if a faculty reads something like that, they usually connect the student with the behavioral intervention teams on campus too, who can then follow up with the student to make sure that they're getting the help that they need. We talked about the virtual office hours already, so just making sure that students know there's a time that they could have a one-on-one with their professors. And I heard some faculty departments doing like coffee hours or tea times. So more, not in an academic way, just a more let's support each other, talk about our lives, what's going on. So making some, specifying some times that students can interact with their faculty in that kind of way during this time of crisis.
My thought,
I would just like to.
my thought is if a faculty member is seeing the things that Teresa just mentioned, it's really important for them to follow up with the student and ask them directly. That, you know, in private, of course, you can ask them by first pointing out the behavior. You know, I noticed that you haven't been participating, or you haven't turned in an assignment, and was a little bit concerned and was wondering what's going on. So students in general, people in general, will often not share that there's a problem unless you ask them. So it's like really important that the faculty member follow up with the student, and then they can make an appropriate referral, if it's a referral to support services at that time, if it's necessary.
I think that's really important, Glenn. I think I'm wondering if faculty are more hesitant to have those conversations now that they are on an online environment. What are some key things of how to start that conversation with a student that a faculty may be concerned about it? You know, it's different from just pulling a student after class and asking them to hang back and having that conversation. Then what are some things that a faculty can do to reach out to that student or even start that conversation?
You would think that it would be really different, but it really isn't. Because if the faculty member notices that there's a problem, like what Teresa mentioned, that could be in something they're writing, some content in which they're saying that something like, I'm getting really depressed, it doesn't seem to be worth it anymore, or, you know, life doesn't seem to be, you know, worth it anymore, or I'm really anxious, I can't concentrate, and you're noticing that they're missing assignments or the quality of work is going down, the faculty member should approach them in a non-judgmental way, in a caring, compassionate way, and say to them, hey, I noticed that you said this in your homework, and I'm a little bit concerned. What's going on? So by creating a safe space for them to kind of explore with the student, to kind of like probe a little bit, you can even ask the student, are you comfortable talking to me about this? To kind of open that space. Once that space is open and the student feels safe and they trust you, they're going to tell you that, yeah, I am struggling. I don't have any money. My landlord's demanding it. I can't focus in on this, or my father is drinking more, and he's hitting people in the house, and so getting that information, then you have to be able to react to it and provide them with referrals to support services. And Teresa, if you could help me out here in terms of your thoughts about support services that faculty can take advantage of from around the country.
Yeah, so there are things happening on campuses through the counseling centers, and then there's also things being held, like I mentioned, through the academic departments. And then the cities are offering things, and even the state governments are offering things. We live in New York City, so we have a really wonderful 24/7 hotline. And what's wonderful, it's called NYC Well. And what's wonderful about it is that they also offer support in chat and text. So some students who don't have privacy can't pick up the phone and talk to a counselor through a hotline because they don't want anyone in the family to hear what's distressing them, and it could be very private. So they can then use their phones and text, or they can chat over the computer and type what their concerns are. And there are counselors available 24/7. It's free, it's confidential. And now the state of New York is also offering free counseling. If the student their mental health needs can't be met in the counseling center, there are all these other ways. On our campus, we're offering support sessions. We have one that's specifically for international students because they're in a particularly stressful time. And then we have one for all students. We also have some mindfulness de-stressing sessions that are being offered through the psychology department. And then I'm going to be starting, I mentioned earlier, a support group for bereavement and grief. Because students are going to be losing so many loved ones during this time. So there's a lot happening. And I think, like you said, Glenn, it's important for the faculty to know what all those resources are. So then if they're hearing from a student, they've checked in with them, and the student says, yeah, I really do need some help right now, they can connect them to the right resources.
Hey, Teresa, we're talking about the students. What about the faculty and the stress that they're experiencing? Can you help me?
Yeah, so some campuses, like at Baruch College, they're offering mindfulness and de-stressing sessions for faculty. And then all the services I just mentioned, the hotlines are all available for faculty and staff as well, for anybody who needs extra support. And then there's also the employee assistance program. So we're part of a larger university system called CUNY, and so it's called the EAP, and that provides some free counseling and therapy to faculty and staff who need extra support at that time.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So I think this brings us to our next and final talking point, which is what can the school community do to support students that need mental health support? And on the screen is a list of different initiatives. Teresa, if you want to start us off on what are some of those things that the entire campus community can do?
Sure, yeah. We talked about the importance of looking at this as a collective responsibility for the whole school and not just falling within the counseling centers, because the counseling centers are overloaded and trying to do the best they can to meet the needs of their students. But within the counseling center, most are now moving to telehealth. So at our center, we're doing mostly Zoom sessions, and if students can't do Zoom, then we're doing phone sessions. So continuing all the one-on-one individual sessions that we were doing before the crisis. And yeah, so most counseling centers have made that transition pretty successfully, and I think it's going pretty well for the students who can do it. We're also making sure that students know about resources to support, like I mentioned, food insecurity, and making sure those needs are met. Some students who are part of religious organizations or religious groups are being able to move online to connect with their religious communities, because services have been stopped, in-person services have been stopped. So for some students, their faith-based communities are really serving to support them during this time. And I think that the most important thing, and we talked about this earlier on, is to continue to normalize and validate all the responses, reactions that we're having, and to let students know that yes, your sleep is going to be disrupted, your eating behaviors are going to be disrupted. you might feel really scared. You might feel angry. Some students are talking about feeling really irritable and angry and frustrated that they've had to make this transition, or they're suffering from the loss. They might not be able to walk for their commencement, something that they've been working so hard for, and just the thought of that. So there's anticipatory losses that haven't even happened yet, but they're thinking about how they're not going to be able to have the normal college life experiences that they thought they were going to have. So just to validate that there are real losses here. Of course, there's the losses to death, but I mean, just the losses of not having the college experience that they signed up for. Glenn may want to jump in.
Yeah, the thought that I had really is that providing services from the college, just like you mentioned, Teresa, workshops, stress management seminars, bereavement seminars, groups, and also just emphasizing the importance of trying to develop a structure in your life to deal with the stressors. I mean, I've been reading some renowned trauma therapists who've been writing on this, and how important it is for people, especially those people who have experienced trauma in their past during these times, is they developed a highly structured routine in order to give them a sense of control that they need to reduce anxiety. So when you get up in the morning at a certain time, you eat breakfast, then you start studying at a certain time, and then you go on to social networking at a certain time, you cook at a certain time, whatever it is your routine is, to try to structure it almost to the point where it's boring. And that provides you a sense of control by sticking to that routine. You're not helpless. You're controlling things within your environment internally. So I guess I'll leave with just encouraging people, faculty and students, the more routinized you can, the more you can structure time with children, for example, at certain times. It helps them to look forward to it, and it puts boundaries and structure in your life. That will be helpful.
I wanted to ask you in this section, where does peer-to-peer support come in? I mean, we know from the data that a lot of students, when they're struggling with psychological distress, they'll turn to a peer, a friend, a roommate, teammate on an athletic sports team. How can, what is the role of that peer-to-peer support now that, that we're not all in the same, students are not all on the same campus or in the same building? How can the same relationship and that same level of connection be maintained throughout this time?
I know that's really critical for me. I mean,
yeah.
I have to have my emotions with my peers. I mean, this is what Teresa said. You have to validate and normalize your thinking and your feelings. And what better way to do it than with your peers? As a matter of fact, I'm going to do that when I get off this webinar and talk to you, Maria and Teresa.
Yeah, so I know some student life organizations within the college and universities are moving the student group events and ways to connect to a remote environment. So we're at Baruch College, we're just going to be starting that this coming week. So yoga classes, meditation classes, platforms for groups to connect with one another. So to keep that sense of community going. So like you said, Glenn, that some students, that's what they need more than anything, is just to hear that other students are going through similar experiences as themselves, and then get the support that way. I had mentioned that in New York City, we have a 24/7 hotline called NYC Well. When you call that number, they actually ask you, would you like to speak to a peer who's had similar experiences as you, or would you like to speak to a licensed professional? And you get to make that choice. And I really love that they've added that. So if you would prefer to speak to someone who's gone through similar experiences, but would be a peer-to-peer conversation, they're now providing that. So I was really happy I actually called the number myself to see what would happen. And that's the first thing they ask.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
That's great.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I just like to
That's awesome.
double emphasize that the more students talk about their thoughts and their feelings, the more they verbalize what's going on in their life, the less negative impact that it will have. If you have people that are listening to you, empathizing with you, understanding you, those are the type of people you want to talk to, share with. Share, share, share. You're going to have a long time to get through this. So take advantage of those social networks and let people continually know what's going on. That's mobilizing yourself.
I want to thank you both for spending the last 45 minutes with me. As we close, are there any other additional tips that you want to share or leave the audience with before we wrap up today?
I would just say to add to what Glenn said, when he said, you know, what are you doing to cope during this time? So finding those little moments of joy. For me, all the flowers are opening up. The trees are blossoming. So when I take my walk to the grocery store, or I get out to do a little bit of walking to get some exercise, I stop and notice all those blossoms along the way. I take some pictures. I share those pictures, finding beauty everywhere I go. Even though there's so much despair around us and powerlessness and helplessness, we can still find those moments of joy and things that we can connect with that spark a little happiness for us, even though it's a really difficult time.
Wow, that's great. You know what thought I came into my mind that resonated with that was just listening to the sound of birds occasionally and just connecting with that. And here I'm doing all this work. I'm somewhat stressed out about it. And all of a sudden I hear the robins have come back, okay? And I hear a robin, you know, chirping away. And I say, oh, that's pretty neat. Mm. Then I go back to getting stressed out. So to have those little times where you do that. That's a great suggestion, Teresa.
Yeah. And I may add, because it may be hard for someone to feel joy, so maybe I'll change it to comfort. What provides comfort for you? Taking a hot shower could provide comfort. Eating a fruit that you love. For me, it's, you know, nature and seeing beauty outside. So maybe if you can't find joy, maybe the word comfort would be a little easier for some folks to digest during this time. Thank you so much for having us.
Hey, Maria.
Absolutely. Yes.
What do you do to relax?
I think I am a person of comfort. So I think things like just laying down and maybe taking a few minutes to read a good book, a couple of pages of a really good novel that takes me outside of what's really happening in today's world is a good way. And I love to cook. So getting myself in the kitchen and preparing a meal and something that's going to make my family happy is a way of de-stressing for me. That's how I find joy. So,
Teresa?
But again,
like I mentioned, I love doing photography, and so I've been taking pictures all along my walks. I have a COVID-19 photo album now of all the beautiful things that I'm seeing, and even the thing, I walk in the cemetery. I live near Greenwood Cemetery, so I love those walks and some of the sculptures and statues and against nature, like that conflict between nature and humankind, and I try to capture that through my photos. So that's something that I've been really enjoying during this time.
Nice.
Awesome. Well, I want to say again, thank you very much to both of you for your time and for sharing some helpful resources, some insights for what schools can be doing, what faculty can be doing, some coping for the students. And I appreciate all the work that you do in your everyday lives. So thank you for the last few minutes that you spent with us. And I wish you all the best as you continue to support students.